Perfect. Okay, letting everybody in now. Awesome. Just waiting for the last couple of people to join. Lovely. Hi, everybody. Good evening. Thank you all so much for joining us for this evening's discussion of Kieran Finnane's Peace Crimes. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm currently broadcasting to you from, the Yagara and Turrbal people. I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Before we begin this evening, I'd just like to start by reiterating some of the information that I mentioned in the email that you were sent earlier with the link to tonight's event. So as I mentioned in that email, you've all been placed on mute, and that's just to avoid any disruption tonight because we are going to be quite a large group, which is wonderful. Of course, that doesn't mean that we won't be having a Q&A session. It will just look a little bit different to how you might be familiar with. So in order to have your questions answered, we'll be using the chat box facility. If you can't see it right now, then you can find the button towards the bottom left of your screen. That will open it up. If you type your question there, it will come straight to me, and then I can read it out along with your name when I'm prompted to do so later in the evening. So start sending me your questions as and when you think of them. I'd also like to mention that we have a special promotion for everybody attending our event this evening, and that is if you use the code EVENT at checkout when placing an order on our website, then you'll receive 10% off that order. It's for the next 24 hours at the moment, so I'll post the link to purchase your copies of Peace Crimes shortly, and I recommend that you get in early to take advantage of that offer. So I would now like to introduce Alex Barwick. Over the past 14 years, broadcaster Alex has worked as a field reporter, producer and presenter at both ABC Alice Springs and ABC Darwin. She is currently the drive presenter on ABC Local Radio in Alice Springs. So Alex, I would now like to hand over to you to begin the conversation this evening.
Thanks, Emma Kate. Good evening. Good evening, everyone. It's really lovely to be with you tonight. And it's such a pleasure to be interviewing our friend and fellow journalist, Kieran Finnane, here in Alice Springs and Buntua. As Kieran discusses in the book Peace Crimes, there is such an established etiquette here in our town when it comes to questioning the military base in our backyard or what anyone does that works there. And I still occasionally meet people in our town who don't even realise that there is this American Australian Defence Facility, less than 20 kilometres down the road. So Kieran's, moral and political deep dive into Pine Gap's presence in Australia, told through the experience of this group of Peace Pilgrims, is just so important. It challenges the reader to ask many questions, and I know later in the chat many of you will have lots to ask. Kieran is a founding journalist of the Alice Springs News. It's the only local newspaper, particularly since News Corp's recent slash and burn of regional newspapers. It breaks more than its fair share of local news stories. We try to keep up at the ABC, but she's extraordinary out here. She also contributes work to publications such as Griffith Review, The Saturday Paper, Monthly Australasia, and her first book, Trouble, came out in 2016. It's absolutely gripping. If you haven't read it, certainly try and find a copy if you can. As is her new book, Peace Crimes, Pine Gap, National Security and Dissent. It's immaculately researched, beautifully written. So Kieran, thank you so much for speaking with us all tonight.
Oh, thank you, Alex, and thank you for that generous introduction.
Let's begin by going back to the night of September 28th, 2016. That's when the group of Peace Pilgrims stepped through a fence towards Pine Gap. They played a lament, they prayed for the dead of war. On that very same day, unbeknownst to them on the other side of the world, something really devastating happened in a small village called Shadal Bazaar. Can you describe to us what happened that day in that Afghani village?
They became victims of the US drone program. So a man had just returned from the pilgrimage to Mecca. His name was Haji Rias, and family members and friends had gathered to welcome him back home. And they had a feast and all stayed in his home in the village that night and were sleeping when at dawn, missile launched from a US drone struck. 15 people were killed and 19 were injured. And they protested that the overwhelming majority of them were civilians. The pilgrims, of course, they were walking that night to trespass on Pine Gap, and they could not have known that was happening or happened on that same date. But later, when they knew of that incident and that it coincided with their action, it made such sense to them, bitter sense, because of the primary motive for them was to draw attention to the US drone program and Pine Gap's involvement in it.
Now
I'm really interested how often readers of the book have brought it up with me. I think it's very hard for us to imagine to ourselves or anybody connected with us being in that situation with that level of vulnerability, going about your daily life and suddenly a missile strike. And it seems just by having that specific example at the start of the book, it has humanized that program that we hear talked about, but it remains a bit abstract for us.
But you're right, you thread those events in Shadal Bazaar throughout the book, and I think it's so important for us to hear you describe them, and so that we keep them in our minds as you talk through what happens to the Peace Pilgrims, because yeah, it is all so interrelated, and yeah, as you go on to raise these questions about how much broader Australia knows about what's going on at Pine Gap, and questions around, you know, how complicit we are in those drone strikes against countries we are or are not at war with. Now, you've lived in Central Australia for quite a long time. What was it that spurred you to dig deeper into what is happening in our backyard here?
My awareness and interest in thinking about Pine Gap was really stimulated by the photograph that is on the front of the book. It's actually an artwork. Christian Lamle-Ruff is the photographer, and he must have done what the Pilgrims indeed did, which is go on to the base to get that amazing photograph. I think it's the closest and best that has ever been taken.
I think Kieran's just frozen. Might wait.
And in the artwork, by this intervention of bars across the front of
yeah, that looks like Kieran's got some issues there with the audio. Kieran, how are you going there?
Sorry, did you just experience an Outback NBN?
Yes, sorry.
Hiatus?
You cut off for a minute there, Kieran. We've got you back now.
Okay. I've actually switched from NBN to Telstra, so fingers crossed. Okay. Yeah. So where were we?
Just talking about that photograph and how unique it is.
So these bars at the front of the photograph, and they're very obvious on the cover of the book, for me, they worked to really draw you into that landscape where the photographer was to take that image, and to think about our proximity here and what our responsibility is in relation to that. and what do we understand about what goes on there. So that photograph really primed my interest, and it was not long after I had seen it that the Pilgrims trespassed on Pine Gap, were arrested, and came to trial about a year later. And then it was covering that trial that really drew me into the story. Well, I learned a lot from them. The way they managed to present a lot of material during the trial about Pine Gap is an incredible achievement. They achieved what a lawyer would not have been able to because of that indulgence that the court must have when a defendant's self-represented. So I think the jury learned a lot. And then I thought, I was very intrigued by their commitment to action and really wanted to understand more about that level of commitment, what would prompt them to risk as much as they did, because they knew they were very likely to face arrest and very likely to face charges under this defence legislation.
Kieran, tell us a bit about this group of Peace Pilgrims and what they were trying to achieve that night as they walked towards Pine Gap.
So you've mentioned that they were lamenting, and I think that was very much at the forefront of their mind, but twinned also with this idea of disruption, which involves, putting your body on the line there on the base itself and seeing what flows from that. To disrupt Pine Gap's activities would be incredibly challenging for anybody, but especially for non-violent protesters who will absolutely refrain from, a physical attack. But this idea of disruption of business as usual, coupled with lament for the dead of war and prayer as well, was the core of the action.
And you make it really clear that it is the faith of many of the pilgrims that is really playing a huge role in their actions. How did you understand the sort of spiritual underpinning of what these activists or protesters or pilgrims were doing?
It's interesting. I'm not a person of faith myself, but I grew up close to faith and the Catholic faith. And I think it made me open and interested in their very strong expression of their faith and the way they live it in their daily lives. I think it's their fire. It gives them the energy and the commitment and the framework and the passion for what they do, which isn't always this kind of action. Those among them who are Catholic workers are very involved in the Catholic worker tradition of the House of Hospitality, which means you open your doors to those in need in whatever way, maybe in social need, maybe hungry, maybe in need of shelter. It's an extraordinary life, a 24/7 commitment that is quite exceptional, I think. Again, the exceptional nature, I think journalists are always interested actually in something that stands out from the crowd in that way. So as I say, I think, the faith gives them that drive, but also puts them in dialogue with their conscience in a very acute way. And I think that was also critical in relation to Pine Gap. They have a politics, obviously, a political framework, and can argue in those terms, but they also have a moral reaction. Their action was an action of conscience. And the faith is a framework that underpins that. Framework, it sounds too abstract a term, but it's that way that their faith enables them to answer those questions about what is right and wrong that really drives them.
When, you know, your description of them, they just come across as strong, but gentle and humble, you know, all at once. And so then when you see how they are considered a threat to national security, that's sort of seems quite bizarre. But can you tell us a bit about this piece of legislation under which they're prosecuted?
Yes, so it was drafted in the Cold War in 1952, drafted very quickly actually, to respond to the circumstance of the first British nuclear test on Australian soil. And clearly the idea was to deter saboteurs or spies, and these quite harsh penalties were part of it for that purpose, one assumes, and written into the legislation at the time, supposedly as a way of protecting citizens from government overreach, was that the Attorney General would have to approve a prosecution. And no one was ever prosecuted under that legislation until a related group of people, and there's a crossover of one person. So Jim Dowling, who you get to know well in the book, in 2005, together with others, 3 others, trespassed onto the base, not only went through the outer perimeter, the cattle fence, but cut through the inner, supposedly man-proof boundary and entered the operations area, together with a young woman called Adele Goldie, and they climbed onto a roof at Pine Gap and famously took photos of one another. And one in particular shows Adele making the peace sign up there, and you can see the domes in the background. It was an extraordinary achievement, a huge embarrassment for the security at Pine Gap. And you can imagine they were arrested. And it was the first time that old Cold War legislation had ever been dusted off and used. And who are they prosecuting? Not saboteurs and spies, but Christian pacifists who did no more than make them look rather silly, especially as they were searched multiple times and still managed to smuggle out that film. So the Alice Springs News took quite some delight, I must say, in publishing that photo, despite being told that we would be liable for prosecution as well. Well, they never did prosecute newspapers, but they tried to throw the book at they were called the Christians Against All Terrorism. And they went through a very significant legal battle and eventually were acquitted because they had top counsel, Ron Merkel QC, and assisted by Rowena Orr, whom everybody has now heard of, now a Silk herself. And they found a loophole in that legislation and succeeded in overturning the convictions on appeal.
Kieran, can you take us into the courtroom? You spent a lot of time in there covering the case of the 4 and then the 1 of the Peace Pilgrims. What was it like in there, particularly given they were representing themselves?
So it was the 5 and 1.
Sorry, yes. Yeah.
Yes, sorry. And I just should say a few words about the 1. So all of them, you know, we said earlier that they walked through the night. And I think we have to recognise like you and I know, Alex, what the terrain is like around here, and they were in fairly hilly country. It's stony underfoot, full of spinifex, loose on the slopes up and down, and they were doing this at night, no moon, no torches. It's quite a remarkable feat. So the 5 went in first together, and the one, Paul Christie, who is a spiritual man, but not a Christian, not a Catholic, he went in on his own a few days later, and he took a different route. He thought that was he was too likely to be detected on that route, and he went in a longer way, walked for a long time through the night. I think eventually had a bit of a sleep inside the territory of the base, and in the morning is found walking along there with flowers and a Tibetan style rattle, praying, and again, you know, he was arrested, charged under this same legislation, and like them, prosecuted, and the call for this harsh punishment of real jail time because supposedly he's a threat to national security. So in the court, you asked me about what it's like for people to self-represent.
Yeah, what was the experience like being in there, listening to them defend themselves in the courtroom setting with all the just, you know, all the rules and all the way, you know, sort of protocol around that, and them just going for it themselves?
So to be fair, the judge, I think, made a considerable effort to assist them and I suppose indulge them as people who weren't trained in the law. So there wasn't a really rigid atmosphere. And in any case, they do very well to upset that. In particular, Margie Pestorius maintained a warm, rather loud at times, very friendly demeanour, using people's first names and laughing and joking, and it was marvellous really to watch her push back against the rather heavy presence of the Commonwealth, who weren't inclined to particularly indulge these defendants. And there was a QC assisted by a very senior and practiced lawyer and instructor, and other legal advisors behind them whispering instructions, representative of the Commonwealth, and then also a Commonwealth solicitor making extraordinary interventions in the court to try to prevent the CCTV footage of their trespass being shown. This was apparently because they were worried about people working out where the security cameras are and where the vulnerabilities in the perimeter might be. There was a lot of grandstanding by the Commonwealth and a lot of pushback by the Pilgrims.
Speaking of just the response of the Commonwealth, was there any resistance to you writing the book, or any concern from any level of government, particularly, I guess, the Australian government, for you putting it together? I know you tried to approach a lot of ministers and didn't get too far with responses, but was there any concern about you writing this book?
No, just the blanket silence, which is the way that they deal with Pine Gap, and very successfully succeed in muting the issue. I mean, it's hard to keep banging your head against that wall, actually, of not ever getting any answers. So I use open source information, and I'm really indebted for the overview that I give of the base, indebted to the work of other investigative journalists and researchers. So what I've done is sort of draw a lot of material that other people have pushed hard to get in order to sort of give a good context for what the Pilgrims were responding to. And I did try to get some answers, particularly from the Defence Minister at the time, Christopher Pyne. He made a ministerial statement about Pine Gap, and it's, you know, full of pompous rhetoric, really, and there are just no answers to any of the question. The usual fob off from Defence that they never comment on intelligence matters, when not one of my questions was about an intelligence matter, but rather about policy, the policy framework for what goes on at Pine Gap and the law that covers it, both the Australian law and the international law. Not one answer. These questions still really need to be answered, and I hope that might be something that people will take from the book, a sense of the insistence that we need to have some answers about those questions. Not digging into intelligence matters in terms that we know we won't get that disclosure, but we should be able to get policy disclosure. Yeah.
From what you did, you know, glean and learn from your research, how do you understand the changing role and scope of the activities happening at Pine Gap?
Well, again, that's other people's research, really. So it has been very clearly demonstrated by those investigative journalists, the researchers, and confirmed by the massive leaks from Edward Snowden, that the role of Pine Gap has become increasingly militarised. And there really is no doubt that participation, the part of the data collection, which has always been what they do, electronic signals collection from satellites, that this data is given to the military for military purpose, for their missions, and is used ultimately connected to the violence against other people, and we are implicated in that. If you're part of the system, you can't just distance yourself from it.
I know you're hoping to generate more conversation and more questions from writing this book, and you certainly have done that. What do you think are the key questions that we should all be asking about Pine Gap now to our government?
Well, essentially, I've just mentioned those two, and I think we also have to ask questions of ourselves about our responsibility, and that would mean that we would remain very conscious and aware, and take the opportunities to press for much greater transparency around its role, and to demand the limitation of its role. I think there's a case to demand that Pine Gap does not participate in the drone program, and a case to demand that it does not participate in nuclear preparedness, and to make it possible for us to sign the treaty banning nuclear weapons. We have to keep it front of mind and find ways to make that a live debate in the Australian community, and to get governments listening.
Kieran, that brings us to a full half hour, and I know lots of people will have their own questions. So I just want to thank you so much for having the chat with me. And also I wanted to just say a shout out. It's lovely to see a number of the Peace Pilgrims themselves on this chat tonight. So I'm not sure if they're keen to share anything, but yeah, it's lovely to see some of you. It's extraordinary what you guys have been through, what you do in your lives. But Kieran, thanks once again, and I'll hand over to Emma Kate.
Lovely, thanks, Alex.
Very much, Alex.
Thanks, Kieran. We've had a couple of questions come through, so I'll start with those, and I'd encourage you all to keep sending them through to me now. First question is from John, who says, do you think Pine Gap will prevent any future Labor government from ratifying the TPNW? They didn't mention it, let alone at it, when they announced at the 2018 National Congress that they would ratify it.
Well, sadly, am I on, Emma?
Yes.
Yes. Sadly, I know there are people in the Labor Party who would love to get that treaty signed. I don't actually know what the proportion is, but if it involved a limitation on what Pine Gap does, at the moment, I just don't think they would win the day, because Labor and Liberal are hand in hand on this. There's no difference between them. When Christopher Pyne, the Defence Minister, made his statement about the so-called joint defence facilities in the Parliament, the Labor shadow stood up and said, happily, I agree with every word that the Minister just said. There's no difference between them. And they're absolutely supine on that, anything to do with Pine Gap, to my knowledge.
Several messages coming through. Deborah says, hi, Kieran. We've had Margie Pestorius, who you mentioned earlier, has messaged in saying hi, that it's so good to be here. We have another question from David, who says that Pine Gap seems to have always been in the news in the 70s and 80s, and why is there silence now?
Well, the Commonwealth has succeeded in really chilling the debate with the chilling protest rather, with this very harsh prosecution of the Christian activists in 2005 and then again in 2016. So in the 80s and 90s, hundreds of people went over the fence at Pine Gap, hundreds, and they were, prosecuted, fined for trespass. And in the prosecution of the Peace Pilgrims, the prosecutor recognised that really it was a simple trespass offence, that it was because it was occurring on this prohibited area that suddenly the trespassers were exposed to the potential of 7 years in jail. So I think that's part of why there's the silence. I think after 2001, after September 11 in New York, I think a lot of people have become worried about the world and perhaps confused and thinking that buying the line, I guess, that Pine Gap keeps us safer. That Pine Gap is part of what keeps us safer by its surveillance. I think others argue that, and with some reason, that is actually contributing to increasing danger for us in the world as we draw the enmity of people who are at the receiving end, particularly of the drone program in countries we're not at war with.
Thank you. Bronwyn has asked, Kieran, what did you think of the ABC drama Pine Gap? What do you think about what it told us about it?
Look, I actually didn't that much care for it myself. I felt like it was a rather conventional drama using the setting for its own purposes. It did acknowledge involvement in the drone program, and that might be something. Yeah.
Dennis is asking, Dennis says, when I asked Rosenberg how did he feel that his information was used to bomb 135 innocent civilians in Iraq, he replied that he just gave the info to the military and they used it, that it had nothing to do with him or Pine Gap. What do you think of that?
Well, I just think that that's indefensible position. It's, as I said earlier, if you're part of the system, you have to accept your moral responsibility in that system. I don't think Rosenberg is being straight with himself.
I think that was the last question that we've had come through. We've had many comments, so I'll just read a couple of them out. Chris says, this is brilliant. I was there at the time, but did not know of all of this. Most relevant to tell the story. Thank you. Deborah says, hi, Kieran, we've organized to get a copy of your book into our library system in the Northern Rivers. Already there's somebody waiting for it to arrive, which is great news. So yes, if anybody would like to send me another question now, please do so. But otherwise, we're just getting lots of compliments thanking us for this event and thanking both Alex and Kieran for a fantastic discussion. So do you have any final comments, Kieran, that you would like to make, or Alex? I can take you back off mute if you like, or else before I open the room up so that you can all join me tonight in thanking Kieran and Alex for this evening's discussion. I'll take you off, Alex, just in case.
I just did wonder whether or not Margaret or Franz, that's two of the Peace Pilgrims I can see, if either of you would be willing to just share a little bit about your experience and also what it's been like working with Kieran on, being part of this book.
Let me find them both here. Hi. So Margaret's just messaged now. She said, hi, it's so good to have so many people on the call. I want people to know that we are still trying to build a peace movement. You can contact me to get peace news through Wage Peace. Margaret, would you like me to take you off mute so that you can, I'll just find you, sorry, because we've got a long list of names here, so it's hard to, are you happy for me to take you off mute, Margaret? If you type yes or no in the chat, then that's okay, sure. Okay, I'm going to unmute Margaret now so that she can say a few words. Lovely, you should be off mute now, Margaret.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks so much for coming. I just wanted to just to say, the gift, it's such a gift. Kieran's book is such a gift. And what I've realized in the last few weeks is that the thing about courageous action, right? Even if it's not that well focused or it's not that strategic or whatever, courageous action has an energy or a life that other types of action doesn't have, because it's like what Kieran said. It's got an interest for people. It picks people's ears up, or it's got an extremity, or there's something about it that lifts people. And I think that's what we found with this action, which really is also embedded in the previous action 10 years earlier that my husband and Jim Dowling had taken with Adele and Donna Mulhern. So, that's been very important to us. And we had a launch ourselves here last week, and Franz and I got to play our lament. Franz has written a beautiful song based on the lament that, that you can access through Facebook and other places. But we took it to Boeing because we were just thinking about drones and the extension of sort of the drones industry, and that, really Pine Gap has been a Trojan horse for the weapons industries to just come straight into Australia and now take over a lot of industry so that money can flow back to the US companies. And so we did a little action with the lament, and we built on the lament at Boeing because we didn't think the webinar would really speak to what we'd done. even though it's a lovely forum, we do like to have a bit of action in our lives. So yeah, so just join us. We are still trying to build a peace movement, and it is, there's a lot of interest in militarization of policing, and Pine Gap is part of that story, and helping young people understand the history of Pine Gap is part of that story. So we've made a video that we hope speaks to young people, and we're hoping this book just moves out. And I know people have given us lovely feedback about the book, because it is such a wonderful homage to all the people who have taken action at Pine Gap. And I want to point out, even on this call, that people like Biff Ward, who is an organizer for the Women's Peace Camp, and there's Deb Stacey, who's been there a number of times as well, and there's and Zoldishtas, who's at Greenham Common, and as we know, is that that some of that Greenham Common action energy was the energy that sourced the first action in the 1980s. So I just want to acknowledge that those sorts of stories are embedded in the book. So if you've been part of any of those movements, you'll find yourself in the stories of the book. And then it was only in the 80s, in the 2000s, when the Afghanistan and the Iraq war were lodging themselves into the industry of Australia in 2004, 5 and 6, or 2004 and 5, that Jim Dowling put a call out and wrote letters to a number of peace activists and said, we really must go. This space is part of the central point of these wars. And only 6 or 7 people answered, and 4 of those people went in 2005. And by that time, the peace movement was broken and shattered and disappeared, because of course it had been paid off by the Labor Party, and the large number of those of us who have been radical activists had been distracted by the party system, which we now know has this whole time been paid off by the corporations. So those people went there in 2005. The wars were still going when we went there in 2016. The drone strikes were increasing at that point, but we were yet to see, even then, the horrors of the bombing of the Syrian cities that occurred after that. And of course, those drone strikes also were perhaps directed out of Pine Gap, are part of that same military system that, first of all, built up ISIS and then bombed the cities of civilians. So we're looking at this idea that, Boeing, for example, builds the aviation, it's aviation for war crimes, and that those war crimes are then shaped through these sort of systems like Pine Gap. So yeah, if you're interested in these sorts of the way these things all weave in together, please make contact, and we'll get you. There's a lot of you actually who are not on our that we're not in contact with, and so we'd love to be in contact with you and young people that who are also interested in these issues.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Margaret. Thanks for agreeing to speak for the end of this discussion. I'm now going to take everybody off mute so that you can join me in thanking Alex, Kieran and Margaret for a phenomenal evening. I've got loads of comments coming through, so I'll take you all off now. Lovely. Thank you very much, everybody.
I just saw my daughter.
A bunch of them.
There they are. Hey.
Lovely evening, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.